Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series where we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the de facto and possibly now deceased speaker of the Cult of Rakdos, Judith, Carnage Connoisseur. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you really like it, please do consider supporting the channel directly either through Buy Me a Coffee or through our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commander builds we'll be covering next. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Judith Carnage Connoisseur is a 3/4 human shaman that costs 3 and Rakdos that has the following ability. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, we choose one. Either that spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink, or we create a 2/2 red imp creature token that deals 2 damage to each opponent when it dies. Breaking down her core stats, Judith is sporting a decently hefty CMC, a below-average stat block for her cost, and a spell-slinging focused ability that helps us either empower our damage-dealing spells, or generates us board presence as we cast our spells instead. Taking a closer look at her ability's first mode, it appears very reminiscent to the already existing Pestilent Spirit, and, for the most part, provides the same benefits, turning all our damage-dealing spells into guaranteed creature removal so long as we're able to inflict a single point of damage to our target, which is very solid at turning Red's cheap and efficient damage-based removal sources into removal that's capable of dealing with creatures of any size, or, as is more likely, allowing us to turn our cheap AoE damage-dealing sources into board wipes to let us retake control of the board, usually while also letting us keep our board state intact in the process. However, the fact that our damage-dealing spells can now also gain us life back while Judith's on board should not be overlooked, as apart from the obvious benefit of letting us pad our life totals while we deal damage is superb at keeping us alive, and can sometimes even make us almost unkillable through conventional damage when used in conjunction with some of our higher damage-dealing board wipes, there are also some interesting interactions it provides with spells that deal damage to us when we use them, which, thanks to them having lifelink, essentially keeps our life total the same, but, for payoffs that care about us gaining life, counts as us having gained all that life back so we can make use of their effects. Then switching gears to this ability's second mode, it functions identically to other already existing effects that allow us to create token bodies as we cast our spells, with the added bonus that Judith's tokens come with built-in AoE enemy-only burn upon their death, which when considering the multitude of other spell-slinging AoE burn-inflicting payoffs our colors have at their disposal, is quite effective at whittling down our opponent's life totals even further as they're destroyed or as we sack them away for value. So, as we can see based on her ability, Judith Carnage Connoisseur is clearly a spell-slinger-focused commander, one that wants us to constantly be casting spells to either turn our damage-dealing spells into kill spells for our opponent's creatures and life gain for ourselves, or to build up our board with burn-inflicting bodies while we cast our non-damage-dealing spells, which is why in this build we'll be running as many instants and sorceries as we can in order to make the most out of these effects, ranging from single target damage dealing effects for Judith to empower that we can alternatively use to deal with other threats or provide value as needed for additional flexibility, cheap and one-sided AoE damage dealing sources to wipe out our opponent's boards whenever we may need, inexpensive on-death reanimation spells to help keep Judith alive against our opponent's attempts to remove her, and plenty of spells that let us dig for more spells while triggering our payoffs in the process. And speaking of spellslinger payoffs, we'll of course be running a suite of them alongside Judith to either inflict more damage onto our opponents as we cast our spells, or to generate us value instead to outpace them, and even including a handful of life gain matters payoffs that convert our healing into additional life loss to cause our opponents even more pain, enabling Judith to throw the wildest Rakdos party Ravnica has ever seen, provided of course there are any survivors to remember it. But for now, let's make our way to the courtyard outside of Vitu-Ghazi on the plain of Ravnica, where we'll find Judith barely standing, blood seeping onto the cobblestones at her feet from multiple stab wounds. She had been so close, just a dagger's throw away from pinning all these murders onto Rakdos and taking control of the guild for herself. And even when that meddling detective ruined everything by discovering that it was Obov the Tristani that was the real culprit, she managed to escape the crazed Dryad's attempts to kill the remaining guild leaders, only to find herself face to face with Massacre Girl, who was out for revenge for her trying to usurp Rakdos. And now she stood in front of her, holding a bloodied barbed knife in her hand and that ugly painted smile, and all too eager to put her down like Rakdos's good little lapdog. But she would find this mark would not be that easy. Even in her wounded state, Judith conjured vicious spiked chains with her magics, lashing out with deadly precision as Massacre Girl lunged in for the kill. She was Judith, Grand Dame of the Cult of Rakdos, and she would not die here today. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. So, kicking things off with our creature base, we'll be spending most of our efforts in this category on building up our spell-slinging payoffs to work alongside Judith, with members that help burn away at our opponent's life totals as we cast our spells, or that help generate us value as we do so instead. Starting on the burn side of the equation, we'll of course be running the archetypal red spell-slinging payoffs, Electrostatic Field, Erebor Flamesmith, and Gutter Snipe, all of which burn all our opponents as we cast our instants and sorceries to whittle down the entire table, along with Firebrand Archer and Kessig Flamebreather, which do the same, but this time whenever we cast any non-creature spell to proc their burn even more frequently, and lastly, the legend Torwaki the Younger, who is again limited to proccing off only our instants and sorceries, but this time lets us deal 2 damage to any target whenever we cast one, giving us the option to have it deal with troublesome creatures instead of going for face if we have to, as well as gaining us life back as he does thanks to his built-in lifelink. And that's on top of also passively amplifying all our other non-combat damage by 1 to help us burn out our opponents even faster. Then, on the more value-oriented side of things, we'll be slotting in both Young Pyromancer and Sedgemoor Witch as token-creating Spellslinger payoffs to work alongside our commander to build up our board as we cast our instants and sorceries, with the latter's token creation also gaining us life back as they die off to synergize with the life gain payoffs we'll be covering later, along with Stormkiln Artist as a passive and repeatable source of ramp via its treasure production to enable us to sling more back-to-back spells, or which we can use to simply stockpile our treasures to cast more spells later. Now, switching gears to the only life gain matters payoff we'll be running in this category, we have the legend Vito Thorn of the Dusk Rose, who can take the potentially massive amount of life gain Judith tacks onto our spells and convert it into life loss to throw it at our opponents' faces, which when combined with our bigger damage dealing spells can outright eliminate opponents at full or even higher life totals out of nowhere. And then to close out our creature lineup, we'll be adding in some miscellaneous support pieces in the form of Mahadi Emporium Master, who takes advantage of our ability to consistently wipe the board with our Death Touch damage dealing spells to provide us with insane amounts of ramp in the form of treasure every time we do so on our turn, and Harmonic Prodigy, whose ability to double up on our Shamans and Wizards abilities nets us twice the token creation out of our commander, and double the usage out of the other 4 Shamans we're running in the 99. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Reaching our instance, which is also unsurprisingly our largest category in this Spellslinger build, we'll of course be aiming to get as much mileage out of Judith's ability as possible by including a variety of damage dealing effects for her to empower, alongside means to protect her and dig for more resources while proccing her token creation every time we cast them. So, starting on the damage dealing front, we'll be running both a Braid and a Cast into the Fire, each of which allow us to use them as damage dealing creature removal or as artifact removal depending on what the situation calls for, with the latter even being able to deal with 2 creatures, Flick a Coin, which is a flash speed damage dealing cantrip that also ramps us via treasure token creation, doing just enough to warrant its inclusion in the build when empowered by Judith, Spikefield Hazard, whose cheap damage dealing effect is okay, but we're mainly running thanks to the flexibility it provides by being playable as a land if we draw into it early to ensure we make our land drops, or as a spell if we draw into it later to proc our commander and other payoffs, and Electrickery, which at base is a serviceable 1 mana damage dealing removal spell, but we'll almost exclusively be overloading it to have it deal 1 damage to all our opponent's creatures, making it the first of many AoE damage dealing sources turned into wipes by our commander, and this one even being castable on our opponent's turns as a bonus. And then as another AoE damage dealing source, as well as a way to protect our board from destruction, we have Wail of the Nim, which for 3 mana lets us either deal 1 damage to each creature and player, or instead regenerate all our creatures. And, if we intertwine it for an extra black, lets us do both, which is what we'll usually be doing in order to destroy all our opponent's creatures while leaving ours intact, though we can occasionally use it in response to removal and/or wipes just to keep Judith alive if we have to. Then pivoting fully into ways to keep our commander and other spell-slinging payoffs alive, we'll be slotting in the instant speed reanimation sources Feign Death, Undying Malice, Undying Evil, and Not Dead After All of which not only protect Judith from destruction for only a single mana, but also bring her back stronger with either a +1/+1 counter in the first 3's case, or with a Wicked Roll token attached to her in the 4th case, as well as Malakir Rebirth, which may not return Judith back stronger and costs us life to use, but makes up for it by being an MDFC which we can play as a land instead if we need to, which like Spikefield Hazard before it, gives us more spells to cast while technically not cutting into the build's land count in the process. Now, with our damage dealing and commander protecting spells covered, let's move on to the spells we'll be using to dig through our deck in order to get to these spells in the first place, such as the card selection spells Demand Answers and Thrill of Possibility, both of which let us pitch excess lands and dead cards to dig for more spells while proccing our payoffs, and the former alternatively letting us sack a spare treasure or a mana rock to it instead to turn it into actual draw, as well as Big Score and Unexpected Windfall, which again let us pitch dead cards for potential playables, this time while also ramping us in the form of treasure generation to help us cast more spells later, along with the creature sacking draw spells Corrupted Conviction, Village Rites, Deadly Dispute, Nasty End, and Plumb the Forbidden, all of which let us turn the imps Judith creates into card advantage while proccing their burn as we do so, as well as proccing Judith to replace the token we sack, with the latter 3 providing us with additional upside via either creating a treasure to ramp us, drawing 3 instead of 2 if we sack Judith or another legendary to it if we can't protect them otherwise, or by letting us copy it multiple times to sack multiple imps for more burn and for more draw. And then to wrap up our instant category, we'll be adding in some core stat improving entrants to the build in the form of the more traditional removal spells Rakdos Charm and Chaos Warp, the former enabling us to cheaply deal with artifacts, while also alternatively providing Graveyard Hate and the ability to burn out go-wide decks, and the latter providing us with flexible non-destruction permanent removal to help us deal with threats that our damage-dealing spells would be unable to, the Ritual's Dark Ritual and a Seething Song, both of which provide a solid bit of one-shot ramp to help us get Judith out ahead of curve alongside a board wipe spell to level the board with, and, ideally, still leaving us with mana open to protect her at least once, and, lastly, the wheel spell Blood for the Blood God, which takes advantage of our various ways to wipe the board by reducing its cost, potentially making it a 3-mana draw 8 that also deals 8 damage to each opponent on top of that. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. It's back to damage-dealing spells as we kick off our sorcery category, though this time we'll be specifically aiming to include AoE damage-dealing spells that we can use to consistently clear the board alongside our commander's Death Touch granting, such as the 1-drops Blazing Volley, Tectonic Hazard, and End the Festivities, all of which deal 1 damage to all our opponent's creatures, with the second also hitting our opponents in the face, and the third hitting them in the face and hitting their walkers, as well as the 2-drops Scoured Sands, Boiled Earth, and Smash to Dust, which again all provide AoE enemy-only creature damage, this time alongside some non-damage centric upsides such as scrying when we use it, turning one of our lands into a creature if we pump more mana into it, or letting us use it to alternatively destroy artifacts or defenders instead. Then, as some slightly more mana-intensive AoE damage-dealing options, we have Mizzium Mortars, which may cost 2 at base to have it deal 4 damage to a creature we don't control, but will almost exclusively be overloading it for 6 to have it deal that damage to all creatures we don't control, which may seem like overkill since the spell in question will have Death Touch, but it gains us so much life back on wide boards that it still makes it worth running. Chain Reaction, which can gain us even more life back, as its damage scales with the number of creatures on board, at the cost of destroying our own creatures as well, which may still be a good thing depending on how many imps we have in play to burn our opponents out with as they die off. And, as our final pure AoE damage dealing spell, we have the classic Blasphemous Act, which for as little as a single mana can deal 13 damage to each creature in play, which in turn gains us 13 life for each creature in play as well, potentially skyrocketing our life totals into the hundreds on wide enough boards to make us incredibly hard to kill via conventional damage. Then, with the overwhelming majority of our AoE damage dealing sources covered, we'll move on to adding in a few more sorcery speed sources of card selection to supplement our instant speed ones. Those being Faithless Looting to allow us to draw 2 and pitch 2 twice per game thanks to Flashback for double the digging and double the cast triggers, and Seize the Spoils as another treasure creating rummage effect to give us even more means to pitch dead cards to dig for playables while ramping us in the process. Now, with our previously covered categories properly supplemented, we'll be adding in a pair of spells to the build that deal damage to us as part of their effects, which thanks to Judith granting them lifelink will actually cause us to lose no life. Those being Wheel of Misfortune, which allows us to bid astronomically high numbers of life in order to ensure we get its wheel effect without suffering any consequences, and since we're technically gaining all that life back, we can combine it with Veto Thorn of the Dusk Rose and other similar life gain to damage converting effects to one-shot players with absurdly high and even infinite life points by simply bidding one higher than their current life totals, and command the Dread Horde, which in this build is just a 6-mana Rise of the Dark Realms, enabling us to reanimate all our and our opponent's creatures for ourselves, as well as their planeswalkers, while technically not costing us any life and still proccing our aforementioned Life Gain Matters payoffs as well. And then, as the only Spells Matters payoff we'll be including in this category, we have Mizzix's Mastery, whose recent reprint has made it much more affordable, and is fantastic in this build when overloaded to allow us to recast all our instants and sorceries from the bin at no mana cost, often winning us the game on the spot if we have our commander and/or enough Spellslinger payoffs in play. And finally, reaching the end of our sorceries, we'll be adding in a few more core stat improving entrants in the form of the removal spells Feed the Swarm and Fiery Confluence, the former being one of the few ways our colors have to deal with enchantments, so we'll run it, and the latter's ability to function as AoE creature damage, artifact destruction, and/or AoE burn depending on what we need, making it flexible enough to earn a spot on this list, along with the draw spells Night's Whisper, Sign in Blood, and Read the Bones, all of which are relatively cheap means for us to dig for more resources while proccing all our payoffs, and whose life loss is insignificant versus the amount of life Judith will be gaining us back. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Finally, reaching our enchantment category, its first half is going to consist of the Spellslinger payoff, Fiery Inscription, which in essence is just an enchantment version of Gutter Snipe to let us deal even more damage into our opponent's life totals as we sling our spells, this time from the relative safety of our back row. And, in a similar vein, the second half of our enchantments will consist of the life gain payoff Sanguine Bond, which this time functions as an enchantment version of Veto Thorn of the Dusk Rose, to give us another way to weaponize all the life gain Judith will be providing our spells with by throwing it back in our opponent's faces as damage. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Briefly staying on the life gain matters portion of our game plan as we enter our artifact category, we'll be adding one more entrant in the form of Aetherflux Reservoir, which is admittedly a pricier addition, but is spectacular in this build as another life gain focused finisher, especially when combined with this build's high damage dealing board wipes, which can often gain us enough life back to activate it 3 times and win us the game on the spot. Then, switching gears onto ways to keep our commander alive, we'll be slotting in Swiftfoot Boots into our artifact arsenal as a relatively cheap source of passive targeting protection that's a bit more proactive than our instant speed reanimation sources, forcing our opponents to either wipe or blow up the boots first in order to deal with Judith, which in turn buys us more time to continue slinging our spells. And then we'll be closing out our artifacts with a suite of ramp sources to help speed up our mana base, consisting of the Mana Rocks Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Rakdos Signet, Felwar Stone, and Mind Stone, along with the land ramp source Wayfarer's Bauble, all of which are cheap sources of ramp to help us get to our CMC 5 commander as quickly as possible. That covers all our artifacts, and since we won't be running any planeswalkers in this build, let's move straight on to our land base. Quickly going over our mana lands, we'll be running Command Tower, Dragon Skull Summit, Foreboding Ruins, Shadow Blood Ridge, and Smoldering Marsh, all of which are lands that tap for both our colors that either always or usually come into play untapped to provide fixing without sacrificing speed, the slow fetches Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and Maestro's Theater, which provide us with more fixing and get lands out of our deck to help improve our odds of hitting more spells to proc Judith and our other Spellslinger payoffs more reliably, and, lastly, Myriad Landscape, which provides us with one last bit of ramp from our land slot to speed up and or fix our mana base with, while again getting excess lands out of our deck in the process. And finally, we'll be running 11 swamps and 13 mountains as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 13 creatures including our commander, 25 instants, 19 sorceries, 2 enchantments, 8 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 35 lands including MDFCs. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have a combined total of 44 instants and sorceries, 16 of which can deal damage to our opponent's creatures, and another 16 of which allow us to dig for more resources, 12 cards that care about us casting our instants and sorceries, 7 of which burn our opponents as we do so, and 5 of which generate us value, 3 cards that take advantage of our life gain by turning it into burn, and 7 ways to protect our commander from targeting and or removal, giving us a solid Spellslinger build with plenty of spells to proc our commander, a decent suite of additional spell-slinging payoffs to work alongside her to burn out our opponents or generate us more resources, plenty of damage-dealing spells to take advantage of the Death Touch and lifelink Judith provides them with, alongside means to dig for more resources while proccing her token creation, a small handful of life gain payoffs that turn all our life gain into even more burn to take our opponents down even faster, and capping off with an array of protection sources to keep our commander alive for as long as possible so we can continue benefiting from her effects. For general deck stats, we have 15 ramp sources, 10 card draw sources, 12 targeted removal sources, and 12 board wipes, with our ramp being slightly higher than normal since we do want to get to Judith relatively quickly, and our wipes being through the roof, though do keep in mind that the majority of them are only AoE 1 damage dealing effects that need Judith to turn them into proper wipes by granting them Death Touch. Then looking at our mana curve, we have 16 1-drops, 26 2-drops, 12 3-drops, 7 4-drops, 3 5-drops, 1 6-drop, 1 9-drop, and 1 11-drop, leaving us with a very low-to-the-ground curve whose highest CMC spells can generally be cast at a significant discount thanks to their own effects. in which we generally want to sandbag casting our commander until we have a cheap AoE damage dealing effect in hand that we can immediately cast alongside her to level the board before our opponents have a chance to react. Then from there, we just have to constantly focus on casting more spells to dig for more spells to cast, to keep our commander alive, and to keep wiping the board whenever our opponents gain a foothold, all while enabling our spell slinging and life-gaining burn sources to tear apart our opponent's life totals in a show of carnage that Judith herself would find quite pleasing. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.49, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, we can consider replacing Swiftfoot Boots with Star of Extinction if we'd rather have another high damage dealing board wipe in our arsenal for our life gain payoffs to take advantage of over more ways to keep our commander alive against our opponent's attempts to remove her, or trading out Seething Song in favor of Torbrand Thane of Redfell if we don't mind cutting into our ramp and spell lineup in order to amplify most of the damage and burn we'll be inflicting onto our opponents and their creatures. Then for upgrades, we can exchange Mizium Mortars for Fire Covenant, which for 3 mana is better than its overloaded counterpart by letting us deal as much damage to creatures as we have life at instant speed. The Legend Mahadi Emporium Master can be traded out for the more spellslinger-oriented legend Burgi God of Storytelling, whose ability to generate us mana as we cast our spells is fantastic at extending our turns and giving our opponents less windows to interact with us in doing so. And Mizzix's Mastery can be shelved in favor of Urabrask, who generates us mana as we cast our spells like Burgi, but also inflicts burn onto our opponents on top of that, and we can easily transform into the Great Works, providing us with another wipe, more ramp, and another way to recur our spells from the bin, all of which we can get uses out of again and again by us just casting our spells. And lastly, if we want to power up our spell lineup, we can sideline the decent ritual Seething Song for the better ritual Jeska's Will, which can generally gain us as much if not more mana back than its predecessor for the same mana cost, and Impulse draws us 3 on top of that to provide the build with ramp and draw. Though considering it was just reprinted and is still sitting at roughly $18, it may actually be more worth it just to buy the Deadly Disguise precon it comes in, instead of buying it individually to at least get a functional deck out of the deal. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the channel subscribers for having helped the channel reach its 17.8k subscriber milestone. Sincerely, thank you all for your continued support, as this channel could not continue growing without it. So, moving on to our upcoming commander builds, seeing as roughly 85% of you either wanted me to or didn't mind seeing me do upgrade guides for the Fallout Universes Beyond precons, that's exactly what I'm going to be tackling next, starting with the Scrappy Survivors precon and, hopefully, covering all of them in the next few weeks, which will then be followed by last week's poll winner, Yaris Roar of the Old Gods, so look forward to those builds coming soon. That said, since the next few weeks are going to be booked solid with precon upgrades, we'll be putting the polls on hold for a bit until we get those covered. So instead, I'd like to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below which commanders from either Murders at Karlov Manor or from the Fallout Universes Beyond precons you want to see me cover in future polls, so I can make sure they can get a chance at a build of their own when the polls open back up. And lastly, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't continue to grow without your support. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to keep me caffeinated via buying me a coffee at the link in the description, or alternatively, use our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product, accessories, board games, or any of their other wide selection of products at low prices that include free shipping for orders over $75, and a rewards program that builds up store credit over time as you make your purchases. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.